as a consultant, which we are, I'd take one step back and ask the question, why are you going to China in the first place? So most of my clients tend to be owner-operated or family businesses, so medium size, who have, if I may say, limited experience internationally or perhaps limited financial resources. And there needs to be still a fairly strict process by which you make a decision whether or not to enter China. So let me give you some examples. First would be looking at the market itself. So we call this our triangle of how to set up or how to consider an investment into China. And that triangle, including the market, means, for example, are you looking to sell locally, or are you going to produce in China to sell overseas, export, which would be a very typical business. The second part of the triangle is the product. What product are you actually looking to either buy or sell in the market, or again export, and how localized does that need to be or change? And the third being the organization, how to actually set up, but that includes filling your company with life, because it's not about setting up a shell to have on your name card, it's about actually transacting business. So I guess the key question really is, are you looking to buy or sell from China? That's one of the very basics. And when you've answered that question, you can then consider what activities, and then as a result, what legal form you should ideally have. Again, let me give you an example. If you're looking to sell a typical Canadian product, let's say in agriculture, you might want to first go a step of setting up a rep office to market that product. The rep office is limited is because it's a purely marketing entity. You cannot issue invoices, so you can't bill clients, you can't actually sell the product. All you can do is market your product. So that scope is limited. The scope is also limited in terms of how many people you can have in that company in the rep office, and the whole setup is just one on a, let's say, promotion basis. And we tend to actually advise going one step further, which is setting up a wholly owned foreign entity. Now, coming back to my triangle, when we look at the market, that really drives where you want to set up your organization. And I think that's one of the next key questions. So let's say you've decided, I want to be in China because I've done my research, there are enough customers there, they understand my product. I know I want to set up my own company, a wholly foreign owned entity, WFOE as it's called, but I haven't figured out yet where. For instance, should I be selling, let's say, winter clothing in the south? That may not make sense. So I'll do that here in the north, in Beijing, for instance. And these are the sort of questions that we very actively go through with clients to identify first all of the things you want to do, you need to do, where you want to be located before you even go into that process of setting up. Why is that challenging, or why is that different from Canada? When you set up a Canadian company, you can basically do it anywhere and operate anywhere throughout Canada. Of course, you're based in a certain location, you're paying tax in a certain location, but it's more of a one country principle. Conversely, if you're doing that in China, you need to have a local setup, let's say for instance in Beijing, and you're registered with the tax office there. You're limited, not geographically necessarily, but you are limited in your scope of business. So one of the key watch-outs in setting up a company in China is defining your business scope. Again, in Canada, you set up a limited liability company, you could do anything from selling clothes, as I said before, to producing air conditioners. It's pretty much covered. You have to get additional licenses, but apart from that, the company itself doesn't need to change in its scope. In China, that's different. You need to define your scope up front. So was location, or actually we could say company form first, even though rep office is not really the priority. Location, and then scope. The next question is what type of company you're looking to set up as a limited company. Are you looking to trade, manufacture, or engage in another form of business? Each of these have different types of registrations and processes. Again, sounds quite complicated. That's why I just keep repeating, be clear about what you actually want to do in the country, and then move into the setup process. Let's step back, look at the different options that we have. One would be rep offices, as I was mentioning earlier, for purely marketing purposes. The biggest, I would say over 90% of companies today set up in China by foreign investors are so-called WFOEs, which I could go into detail as well, what type of WFOEs there are, and the third block being joint ventures. And they had a very special place in history, so maybe I'll talk about those first. When China began to open up in '82 and onwards, the preferred investment, if at all, was one of a joint venture. Today, this is not as frequent anymore, because again, you as a small, medium-sized enterprise, would you rather have a joint venture with an unknown or foreign party, or would you have your own subsidiary that you can control to 100%? And that really depends on the industry. So let me give you an example for joint ventures. There are certain industries where it's necessary to have a joint venture. The Chinese government has limited the scope of work that you're allowed to engage in, such as power generation or distribution, or what's called a sensitive industry. So if you're making armaments or arms in general, you have an obligation to enter China through a joint venture. There are different types of joint ventures. The most prevalent being the so-called equity joint venture, and the equity joint venture, then it's open in how the shareholding can be distributed. It could be 1 to 99%, it could be 50-50, 80-20. What's critical to look out for is the constitution of the board. So your Chinese partner could have less than 50% of the shareholding, but have more board members than you and outvote you. So this is something very critical. When you're going through that process, you have to figure out your different negotiation points within the setting up of such a joint venture. And if you look at joint ventures traditionally, there are some that have worked very, very well, but they tend to be more for big companies. Best example is the automotive industry. So that would be a sensitive or restricted industry where international OEMs, from North Americans to Germans, have to engage in a joint venture with a Chinese partner. And that's been the case since the opening of China. And these are companies who've done very, very well. But when I speak to some of the senior people at those companies on the international side, what they definitely tell me is that the level of management of the parties is supremely complex. And if I were an SME, I am an SME, but to an SME client, that would probably be too much to manage from 10,000 kilometers away. So I mentioned the equity joint venture just now as being the most prevalent. There's also a so-called contractual joint venture. So you have a company in which the allocation of work is defined, hence the word contractual, whereas you could still be the majority shareholder. So it's not driven by the shareholding structure, the equity structure. That would be the equity joint venture per se, whereas a contractual joint venture is more, if I put it for lack of a better description, on paper, a joint venture. An equity joint venture is an actual production facility. So let me offset that in a negative sense. If you wanted to set up a manufacturing capability with a partner, you could not do it in a contractual joint venture, you would do it in an equity joint venture. That's an example of joint ventures, but once again, most of the companies set up in China today are wholly foreign-owned enterprises, the 100% daughter company, and as I said, there are different types. The simplest straightforward type is a so-called trading WFOE, with which you are able to basically buy and sell goods in and out of the country. So for instance, Canadian goods imported into China, for which you need an import license, but that's part of that process as well. And you can then directly bill customers in China through this trading WFOE. If you're a producer of, for example, machinery, you would probably set up a manufacturing WFOE. That would mean, and it has obviously also different requirements in what space, what safety regulations, EPA and so forth you have, but that manufacturing WFOE will allow you to produce. So as opposed to the trading WFOE, which is just buy and sell goods, the manufacturing WFOE allows you to produce goods on site here in China and either export overseas or bill to local customers. I think those are probably the two main ones. A smaller one, but that's growing quite strongly today, is the so-called consulting WFOE. Now, the consulting WFOE enables you to provide services. If you pick up the newspaper, you read a lot about the structure of the Chinese economy and how the Chinese government is pushing towards more service orientation and service companies. That fits together. I would even draw this arc of the investment that has traditionally taken place used to be production or just for export. Now we're talking about selling to local customers and now providing service. So again, rep offices, WFOEs, which are the biggest part and have many different types, and joint ventures. We recommend, quite honestly, WFOEs most of the time. It's fairly straightforward to set up nowadays. Some people or some clients ask me, well, does that mean I'm constrained? If I set up one company, I can't do other operations? Of course, the answer is yes, but you can set up multiple companies. So in the end, you're compartmentalizing each of the different activities and operations in different setups. And that You could argue sometimes limits your flexibility. On the other hand, it does really force you, and I think that's positive, it does really force you to consider very carefully what your plan is in China. There is, however, a management issue, which is you don't want to set up too many companies either, because otherwise it becomes intransparent in running a business. As a business owner myself, I can say I want to reduce the level of complexity in the business, and I want to reduce the risk in the business, right? So the complexity in the business means I do have a certain setup if I were a manufacturer, for example, with multiple WFOEs. But what I would not do is multiply this in every location in China that I'm planning to buy, sell, manufacture. So I set up here in Beijing, I set up in Changchun, I go down south to Guangdong, for instance. I would probably not set up a WFOE in every location. It depends on the nature of that business. So perhaps the production facility is in North China, the manufacturing WFOE. The trading WFOE may be in Shanghai, because that's where my salespeople sit and where most of my customers sit. And then I have a second sales office in the south, as an example. I can make that a branch of one of my existing WFOEs. I do not need to set up an entirely new WFOE.